The chilling winds of the Alaskan wilderness howled through the dense pine forest, carrying the scent of an approaching storm. The towering trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with freshly fallen snow. Deep within this frozen expanse, a mother bear and her two tiny cubs trudged through the snow, their breath rising in misty clouds. She was weak, her ribs faintly visible beneath her thick fur. Food had been scarce this winter, and her body bore the marks of endless struggles, deep scratches, old wounds, and the exhaustion of motherhood. But she pressed on, driven by an unbreakable instinct to keep her cubs safe. The little ones stumbled through the snow, their tiny paws sinking with each step. Their mother would pause every few moments, nudging them forward with a gentle growl of encouragement. She knew they had to find shelter before nightfall, before the wilderness revealed its true, merciless nature. As they reached a frozen river, the cubs hesitated. The ice was thin, groaning under the weight of the brutal winter. But there was no other way. The mother tested it first, stepping carefully onto the glassy surface. It held. Slowly, she guided her cubs forward, one careful step at a time. Then, the crack. A deep, gut-wrenching sound echoed through the forest as the ice shattered beneath them. One of the cubs let out a terrified squeal as it tumbled into the freezing water below. The river, a silent predator beneath the ice, was swift and merciless. The current pulled the tiny creature under. Without hesitation, the mother bear roared and leaped into the icy abyss. The cold stabbed through her thick fur like 1,000 knives, but she fought against the current, pushing through the deadly waters until she reached her drowning cub. Gripping it gently in her powerful jaws, she surged upward, breaking through the surface, her eyes filled with desperation. But the river wasn't done with her. The current yanked at her exhausted body, pulling her under again. She struggled, gasping for air, her massive limbs growing heavier with each passing second. The cub clung to her, shivering, too weak to cry. With one final surge of strength, the mother pushed her cub toward the edge of the ice, where the other sibling stood, trembling. She used the last of her strength to lift her baby onto solid ground. The cubs huddled together, crying for her to come back. But she couldn't. Her body, drained and frozen, could fight no longer. The river claimed her, pulling her into its icy depths as her cubs watched, their tiny bodies trembling, their innocent eyes filled with confusion and sorrow. The storm raged on, the wind whispering through the trees as if mourning her loss. The two cubs, now alone, huddled together, their mother's warmth already fading from their tiny bodies. But in their eyes, a spark of her strength remained. She had given them a chance to survive. And as the first light of dawn broke through the darkened sky, the forest stood witness to the silent legacy of a mother's last sacrifice. The storm raged through the night, and by morning, the frozen forest was eerily silent. The two cubs remained huddled together, their tiny bodies trembling from cold and exhaustion. Their mother's scent was fading, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving air of the wilderness. They were alone now, too weak to search for food, too young to understand the depth of their loss. Days passed. Their fur was matted with ice, their breaths shallow. Hunger gnawed at their fragile bodies, and their whimpers became weaker. The forest, once their home, now seemed like a vast, endless graveyard of snow. Then, footsteps. An old woman, wrapped in layers of fur-lined clothing, trudged through the deep snow with the aid of a wooden staff. She had lived on the edge of this wilderness for decades, her small cabin nestled between towering evergreens. She knew the land, its dangers, its beauty, and she knew its suffering. Her sharp, weathered eyes caught movement near the base of a tree. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, the way snow piled upon itself. But then she saw them. 2 tiny cubs, barely clinging to life. She gasped, her heart aching at the sight. Their mother was nowhere to be seen. It didn't take much to understand what had happened. She had witnessed nature's cruel tests before. Kneeling beside them, she placed a trembling hand on the smaller cub's fur. Ice had settled in its thick coat. Its little body barely responded. The other cub weakly raised its head, its sunken eyes staring up at her, searching. Pleading. "You poor little souls," she whispered, her voice cracking. Without hesitation, she unfastened her heavy cloak and gently wrapped the cubs inside, holding them close to her chest. Their frail bodies barely weighed anything. They were so light, too light. They had been starving for days. The journey back to her cabin was slow and difficult, the weight of time pressing on her old bones. But she did not stop, nor did she let the howling wind deter her. She had to save them. When she finally reached her cabin, she pushed open the heavy wooden door, warmth spilling out like a welcoming embrace. The room was filled with the scent of burning wood and dried herbs, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. She hurried to the fireplace, unwrapping the cubs and placing them on a thick, fur-lined blanket. They shivered violently, their small forms barely moving. The woman moved quickly. She heated some milk, crushing medicinal herbs into it, and carefully fed them through a small wooden spoon. The cubs were weak, but instinct made them lap at the warm liquid, their tiny tongues barely able to move. For hours, she sat with them, rubbing their frozen paws, whispering soft reassurances. "You'll be all right now, little ones," she murmured. "I won't let you die." Days turned into weeks. The cubs, though frail, began to recover. Their fur regained its soft sheen, their ribs no longer pressed so sharply against their skin. They still whimpered in their sleep, calling for their mother, but they had begun to trust the old woman. She spoke to them often, telling them stories of the forest, humming lullabies as she rocked them near the fire. She made them a bed of soft furs and kept them warm through the bitter winter nights. As the days passed, they followed her around the cabin, their once weak legs growing stronger. They played, they tumbled, they grew. And though the sorrow of their mother's sacrifice still lingered in their eyes, they had found a new home, a second chance. The old woman, once alone in the wilderness, now had 2 small shadows following her everywhere. And though they would one day return to the wild, for now, they were safe. For now, they were loved. Years passed like the turning of autumn leaves. The tiny, fragile cubs who had once shivered on the old woman's doorstep had grown into strong, majestic bears. Their fur had thickened, their muscles hardened, and their instincts sharpened. But no matter how large they became, to the old woman, they were still her little ones. She had watched them learn, play, and thrive under her care. She had nursed them through sickness, fed them through harsh winters, and whispered to them by the fire, her voice filled with warmth and love. But she always knew this moment would come, the day they would leave. One morning, as the sun painted golden streaks across the sky, the bears stood at the edge of the clearing, their massive forms silhouetted against the forest. They turned to her, their deep brown eyes filled with something unspoken. Gratitude. Love. A silent goodbye. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not hold them back. She had always known they were not hers to keep. "Go on, my loves," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your home is out there." With a final, lingering look, they turned and disappeared into the wilderness, their enormous paws silent against the forest floor. The cabin felt emptier after that. The old woman still spoke to the trees, hummed to the wind, and tended to the land, but there was a silence that hadn't been there before. She missed them more than she had ever imagined. One crisp autumn evening, the old woman stepped outside to gather firewood. The air was cool, the leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. She had ventured a little farther than usual, her frail hands gathering broken branches as she hummed an old tune to herself. Then, a sound, a low, guttural growl. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. Two wolves stood a few feet away, their yellow eyes gleaming with hunger. Their ribs pressed against their thin fur, their bodies tense and ready to pounce. These were not the timid forest wolves she had seen before. These were desperate, starving predators. The woman tightened her grip on the bundle of sticks, but she knew she was defenseless. She was too old to run, too weak to fight. Her breath came in short gasps as the wolves inched closer, their lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. She took a shaky step backward. A snarl erupted. The wolves lunged. She closed her eyes. If you're loving this story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a tale like this. What do you think will happen next? Drop your guesses in the comments below. Now continuing, she closed her eyes. Then, a thunderous roar. The ground trembled as something massive crashed through the trees. The wolves barely had time to react before a monstrous shadow leaped into their path. It was them. Her bears. No longer cubs, they towered over the predators, their once small forms now hulking and powerful. Their fur bristled, their sharp claws gleamed in the fading light. One of them let out a deafening roar, shaking the very air. The wolves hesitated, their hunger outweighed by sudden terror. One turned to flee, but it was too late. The larger bear swiped its massive paw, sending the wolf flying into the underbrush with a pained yelp. The second wolf barely had time to react before the other bear lunged, forcing it to retreat into the trees. Silence fell. The danger had passed. The old woman, still trembling, looked up at the creatures before her. No longer cubs. No longer helpless. These were the mighty rulers of the forest. And yet, as they turned their deep brown eyes to her, she saw something familiar. Something gentle. She reached out with a shaking hand. "My sweet boys," she whispered, her voice breaking. One of them stepped forward, pressing his enormous head against her frail body, nuzzling her with the same tenderness he had as a cub. The other bear stood protectively at her side, his watchful gaze scanning the trees, ensuring no harm would come to her again. Tears streamed down the old woman's face. They had not forgotten. No matter how wild they had become, no matter how many years had passed, they were still hers. The old woman stood between her bears, her frail hands stroking their thick fur, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. They had returned. They had saved her. She whispered words of thanks, her voice trembling with emotion. But the danger wasn't over. A rustling in the underbrush. Low, menacing growls. She turned. Emerging from the shadows, 5 wolves stepped into the moonlit clearing. Their yellow eyes burned with vengeance, their sharp teeth glinting in the pale light. Among them were the 2 wolves who had barely escaped the bear's fury before, now reinforced with a new, deadlier pack. The bears let out deep, thunderous growls, their bodies tensing for battle. The old woman could feel the vibration in the ground beneath her feet. The wolves circled, testing, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, they attacked. The clearing erupted into chaos. The largest wolf lunged at the bear closest to the woman, its jaws snapping. The bear met it mid-air, their bodies colliding with brutal force. Claws raked through fur, teeth tore into flesh. The second bear swung its massive paw, sending another wolf tumbling across the ground, but a third latched onto its hind leg with a vicious snarl. The old woman screamed as a fourth wolf darted toward her, its fangs bared. But before it could reach her, one of the bears intercepted it, clamping its powerful jaws around the wolf's throat and shaking it violently. A sickening crack. The wolf fell limp. The pack was relentless. One of the wolves pounced onto the back of the older, larger bear, sinking its teeth into his shoulder. The bear roared in pain, trying to shake it off, but another wolf took the opportunity to lunge at his exposed belly. Blood sprayed onto the ground. The second bear, seeing its brother in trouble, roared with fury and threw itself into the fray. It bit down on one wolf's spine, tossing it away like a rag doll. The injured bear managed to gather its strength and, with a final burst of energy, slammed the last attacking wolf into the ground with a devastating strike. A moment of silence. Then, two remaining wolves, seeing their fallen packmates, turned and fled into the darkness. The battle was over. The old woman stumbled forward, her heart pounding, her breath ragged. 3 wolves lay dead in the clearing, their bodies motionless under the moonlight. But her eyes were on the bears. Both were injured, their fur stained with blood. One bear, though wounded, stood protectively beside her, still strong enough to fight. But the other? The older bear, the one who had taken the worst of the battle, lay on his side, his massive chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Deep gashes covered his body, and blood pooled beneath him. His eyes, once full of fire, now flickered weakly in the night. The old woman fell to her knees beside him, her trembling hands running over his matted fur. Tears blurred her vision. "No, no, my boy," she whispered. "Stay with me." The bear let out a low, rumbling sound, not of pain, but of reassurance. His body was weak, but he was alive. He had fought for her, protected her. And he had survived. The second bear pressed its head against its wounded brother, a soft, grieving sound escaping its throat. The old woman stroked his fur, her fingers trembling. "You saved me," she whispered. "You both did." Days turned into nights, and nights into mornings. The old woman never left the wounded bear's side. She tended to his wounds with hands that had once nursed them as cubs, whispering soft lullabies as she worked. Her world had shrunk to the rhythm of his slow, labored breaths, the quiet rustling of fur, and the deep, steady presence of his brother, who never left his side. And then, one morning, as the golden sunlight spilled through the wooden window, the old woman stirred from her chair. Her weary bones ached, but her heart was light. Because there, in the soft glow of dawn, the bear stood. Not with struggle, not with pain, but with strength. She let out a small gasp, her hands flying to her lips as tears welled up in her eyes. The stronger bear rumbled with excitement, nudging his brother, as if to say, "You did it." The wounded bear turned his massive head toward the old woman and took a slow, deliberate step forward. And then another. Before she knew it, he was standing before her, towering and strong once more. His deep, dark eyes, once filled with pain, now held something else. Something unbreakable. Love. Before she could react, he did something she never expected. He lowered his giant head and gently pressed his forehead against hers. A silent thank you? A promise. She let out a soft sob, wrapping her frail arms around his thick fur. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered. "You're home. From that day forward, the two bears never left. They could have returned to the wild, to the deep forests where they belonged. But they stayed. Not out of duty, not out of need, but out of love. Every morning, when the old woman stepped outside, she would find them waiting, two mighty creatures, sitting just beyond her doorstep like children eager to greet their mother. She would smile, her heart swelling, and open her arms. And just like before, just like when they were cubs, they would nuzzle into her warmth, their massive forms curling beside her like oversized children seeking comfort. The village whispered of the miracle of the beasts who chose a human over the wild. But she knew the truth. They were never just beasts. And she was never just a woman. They were something more. A family. Bound not by blood, but by something far stronger. By love that defied nature, time, and fate itself. And until the last breath left her body, she knew she would never be alone. Did this ending make you emotional? Let us know in the comments, and also let us know where are you watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more.